Hello, everyone. This is Kent Ellett. I'm the instructor this year for the church and Jesus's mission, um, the temple theology. Jesus being the temple is the lesson for this week. You were to read pages 4 through 14, I believe, and so this is the lecture for, I think it was February, let's see here, February, not the 23rd, but it would be January 30th. So next Tuesday, January 30th. Anyway, welcome. And I want to talk about Jesus being the temple today. And I'm not going to go through the reading per se, though I'll touch on the highlights of that. What I'm going to try to do is give you some background stuff that will make that easier. The first 5 lessons in this workbook are by far the hardest conceptually for those of us who are not used to thinking of Jesus as the temple and not thinking of salvation being the renewal of the temple's work in the world's life. Then these first 5 lessons are conceptually the most difficult. But once we get that down, I think the rest of it is smooth sailing conceptually. And so I'm going to try today to talk about some of the difficulties that I anticipate you may be having about thinking of Jesus as a temple. The first one, obviously, is that Jesus is a person. He's a human being, right? God comes to us in the Jewish Jesus of Nazareth as a human being, a little baby in Bethlehem, a young man who goes to the temple when he's 12. But as a human being, we have a difficult time thinking of the temple and human being the same thing. Of course, we can think of our bodies being the temple of the Holy Spirit, but I want us to think in a similar kind of vein today that Jesus is that place where heaven has come down to dwell on earth. I want us to think of Jesus as that place where the glory of God is visibly present in the world when he comes in the incarnate Jewish Jesus of Nazareth. And so I want to talk about the difficulty of thinking of Jesus as a temple, because he's obviously a person and not a physical structure built by human hands, as the text says. Another difficulty that we might have about talking about Jesus as the temple is the temple kind of implies for some people, right? Some people think of the temple as a previous kind of primitive theology. When we grow up, we graduate to the idea, and the way some of us might kind of think about this, and we probably have thought some of this this way since we were kids, that God is everywhere. We know that God is a spirit, and that God is far above our capacity to imagine. And so we know that God is over all and above all and through all things. And it seems a little old-fashioned and primitive and even childlike for God to be specifically present in a specifically holy place, right? And so I grew up in a tradition that kind of rejected the idea of sacred space. The church building wasn't sacred, right? It was just a bunch of construction material. What was sacred was God's people, and God's people were sacred because the Holy Spirit dwelled in them, and that's what made us a temple. But wherever God is in people, he's inhabiting some space. And wherever the church is gathered, the church is a collective temple of God's Spirit and of the temple of Jesus Christ. He lives and moves in us. And so if Jesus came and he is the embodiment of the God of Israel, then God was very specially present in one particular space in the Jewish life of the Jesus, the Nazarene. So an incarnational belief that Jesus is really the God of Israel come to us in human form then means that God can specially take on a special place and be specially present in that space. And so those kinds of ideas kind of get in the way of all of this. And I want to talk about Jesus today as the temple. One of the things that will be helpful to think about this is if you think about the Bible as a story about the temple. Eden is the Hebrew word for paradise, and Eden is the most popular name in the ancient Near East for a temple compound in which there were sacred gardens, right? And the sacred gardens would heal, and there would be living water that flowed from these sacred compounds, which flowed out from them and gave life. Now, Adam, of course, his sin defiles the holy place and it wrecks the force field of heaven's holiness, which is centered around a sacred tree. And so the first universal high priest of humanity, and Adam's name means humanity, he was then expelled from the garden, right? That place where the intimate communion with God and the other harmony that we could know with creation, that place where God's heavenly footstool touched the earth, that place where there was intimate communion with God, right? That has been defiled. And the command was for the human and the living one. Of course, Eve's name is the living one. Eve means living. Now, the command was for them to be fruitful and to multiply and to what? Fill the earth. In other words, Eden, as the first universal temple for all mankind, its job, the high priest's job, was to be fruitful, multiply, cultivate the garden, and fill the whole earth. And so the whole earth, it was God's plan for the whole earth to become an Eden, right? But instead, God's temple agency in making the whole world a garden spot is defiled by the death that Adam and Eve bring on. And the cherubim banished and guarded humanity from entering into the heavenly garden that had been installed on the earth. And so Near Eastern temples, Near Eastern tabernacles, as they developed through history, were ways of seeking this reconnection to that primordial past, that Eden. I think within each of us, there is this memory of Eden, a sense that the world is just not quite what it's supposed to be. And so the stream which fills the pools beneath the temple in Jerusalem, is called the Gihon, right? And some of you will remember that the Gihon is one of the streams which once flowed down outward from the holy hill of Eden. Eden's a temple compound. It's elevated, and all the living streams flow outward and downward in four directions. It's kind of like a ziggurat, okay? So a Near Eastern temple was an attempt to renew the holiness of creation, right? To renew the holiness of creation, at least in that one sacred, clean, set apart spot, so that it would be possible for heaven and earth, God and creation, to be mysteriously joined together so that creation as a whole could be made more holy, more just, more like the harmony that God intended. And so this is the case with the tabernacle, but even before that, the tabernacle is kind of trying to restore Eden, so to speak. But even before that, Jacob has a dream, right? The ancestors have these kind of encounters with God. Heaven breaks open and they encounter Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do. They encounter God. Jacob has a dream at Bethel. Now, what does Bethel mean? Bethel is a word which means house of God. House of God, and where the ancestor of the Israelite nation received and met God, right? This was a sacred place. This place where God had promised to give his descendants the land of promise. And there you might remember from Genesis 28 that Jacob saw a ladder connecting heaven and earth at that place. And thus he called the place the house of God, or the gateway of heaven in Genesis 28:17. And so from that place, God would bless and recreate the land so that it would bring life and blessing for Jacob's children. It was a place of special divine presence through which the world could be shaped according to God's original intent. Original intent, I'm sorry. So you can think about the story as it goes along. Moses saw God's holy fire atop of Mount Sinai. And it was there that the divine glory fell. And the tabernacle was God's way of preparing the people to carry that Sinai experience where God's glory came down and met with Moses. And everywhere the tabernacle went, this experience of God's glory, leading the people, being present in Israel's midst, was going with them. David had a zeal for God's house, Psalm 69 says. And his love for the tabernacle led him to suffer injustice and to, he really pursuing God's cause to renew the tabernacle by bringing that Sinai experience embodied in the tabernacle to a new home in Jerusalem, to a new home on Zion's hill. And there, David wanted to build a temple for God. His zeal for God's house was great, and he wanted to renew God's tabernacle by making it into a temple. And of course, David is told in 2 Samuel 7 that he will not build a house for God. But God tells David, in a play on words, a kind of double entendre for house, a double meaning of house. No, David, you won't build me a house. I will build a house for you. And of course, what God is talking about is he's going to build a dynasty. God is going to build a royal dynasty that David's heirs would take the throne, and that the rulership of David, the rulership of the house of David, would last forever and ever. And so the dynasty then, the first king of that dynasty, Solomon, did get to make the house. And so God says, no, David, you're not going to make a house for me. I'm going to make a house for you. And that house is going to make a house for me. you get the double entendre. If you want to go back in 2 Samuel 7 and read that little exchange, it's wonderful to kind of get in your mind that whenever the word the house of God is used in the Old Testament, this double entendre, this double meaning of house exists. Okay. And so here's the initial point I'm wanting to make. Number one, in important ways, the story of the Bible is the story about how God renews this mission of the temple. how he renews the creative power of Eden in an effort to renew creation, which has gone off the rails. The temple or God's house refers both to the structure of the temple and the nation or the family represented in the house of David. And this house of David, God has got a special plan for, and it is to bless all the nations of the world. It's to bless all of creation. And so the Bible begins with the story of the temple, Eden, in the garden. And it ends with the story of the temple coming down out of heaven from God and lodging itself in creation once again, so that now the dwelling of God is with men, and then the whole creation is filled with the glory of God, and there's no walls or a temple necessary, for the whole earth becomes the temple. And this is the beginning and end of our canon of Scripture. The whole Bible really is, in many important ways, a story about how the temple finally does accomplish its mission in recreating the whole world, making the whole place a paradise filled with the glory of God. Throughout the Bible, then, there are what we might call temple renewal moments where the temple is being renewed. There are movements of people who are trying to renew the ministry of the temple. And I want to talk about some of those today in terms of the shape of the Bible and the shape of the expectations of the people who interpreted Jesus when he came. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about how the Psalms kind of have a revolution of temple theology in between books 3 and 4 of the Psalms. All right, in Psalm 73, the psalmist laments that the wicked seem to prosper. I'm trying to do my best, Lord, and things are not working out well for me and my people. And in Psalm 73 and 16, the psalmist says, I tried so hard to understand why life didn't seem to be fair like all this. And he says, all of this was oppressive to me until, now get this one, until I entered the sanctuary. And then the priestly psalmist understood. He says, I understood the wicked's final destiny. The temple in Israel was a holy place where the future of God was mysteriously felt and visibly depicted. All right. When that priest went in, he could feel the palpable presence of the mysterious and the transcendent. And the future of God, which exists in heaven and exists in God's own heart and mind, even in this moment, right? That future of God was mysteriously felt and visibly depicted on the walls of the sanctuary, the place where God had promised that his name would dwell forever, was a vision of Eden, the very first temple, the very first temple garden, that holy compound where eternal life was once available. On the walls of the temple, the priestly worshiper could see God's intent for a world full of righteousness and health and fertility. And the vision helped the person who was oppressed by the injustices of the world, who couldn't understand how all of these bad things could be happening, right? He sees a vision of the end, and he knows that the wicked in the end are not going to prosper, and that righteousness is going to triumph, and God's creation and love and life and righteousness are going to flourish over the globe. And so he enters the sanctuary, and then everything is changed for him. His experience of injustice is transformed because he can see and he can sense what is coming. The temple was a foretaste of glory divine. Uh, Fanny Crosby said that, I think. Yeah. So, book 4 of the Psalms begins with this way of Israel hanging on to hope in God by clinging to the promise that the sanctuary depicted in its architecture, how it depicted the very end of time when God would make all things new. But then in Psalm 74, we find that Mount Zion, where God has dwelt and has been made, where he's made it into a holy place, where the psalmist in Psalm 73 could really get a hold of what great things are coming, right? In Psalm 74, we find out that the temple has been made an everlasting ruin. And so there is this great crisis of faith that happens in book 3 of the Psalms. And it continues in many ways through those Psalms, and then climaxes in Psalm 89, which is a terrifying complaint and a lament directed at God. And it says, God, you've promised your holiness. You promised on your holiness, right? That you would not lie to David and that his line would continue forever, and that you were going to use us, the Israelites, to make the world new, and that you were going to use us to do great things, and you were going to be present and protect us and guide us and all of those things. But verse 39 says, you have renounced your covenant with your servant, and you have defiled the crown. You've defiled the king's crown in the dust. And so there's a real crisis of faith happening in the Psalms at that point. Then book 4 begins at Psalm 79, or at Psalm 90, rather. I'm very sorry. Psalm 90. It's of great importance to the Psalter, to the Psalms as a whole, because its origin is even traced to Moses. And in Psalm 90, a kind of theological revolution takes place. People in exile have learned to pray, Lord, you have been this is Psalm 90, verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place through all generations. So, even when the people are sent to exile and the temple has been torn down, even when the temple's protective walls are torn down and the symbols of God's covenantal protection around Israel and around the land are all gone, God still is with his people, and he's being a refuge, a dwelling place himself. Even when they're in captivity in the east, in Babylon, Israel has still got a refuge, a dwelling place where God lives. You have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. So it's not only that God is still with us in exile. What's more, God has always been with us. God has always been that temple. God has always been that palpable place of God's protective presence. It was not the tent or the walls that were ultimately protective. It was the presence of God that was our true dwelling place. And the person of God here is that dwelling place. God Almighty is our dwelling place. Wow. So you can see how this kind of anticipates the idea that Jesus is our dwelling place, that Jesus is that special place where humans and God can commingle and be together. There are also temple reform movements in the prophets, and the prophets kind of do similar things to what the Psalms have been doing there, and I've tried to kind of introduce to you in a very cursory way, but we'll just blow through the prophets here real quick too, and say that the prophets were interested in temple reform as well. Ezekiel 11:16 says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says." Are you listening? "Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone," which is what we've been arguing from Psalm 90. Okay, that God himself becomes that sanctuary. The person of God becomes that personal place in which we can live and be protected and meet God in a kind of holy encounter. Isaiah 8 in verse 14 says something similar. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one who you are to dread. And he will be a sanctuary for both houses of Israel. He will be a stone that causes men to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. So here again, Isaiah says that God himself can be a sanctuary in which we can dwell. We can dwell within the presence and power and person of the divine. Now, he says something else also, right? That sanctuary can be a stone that causes men to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. And most of us have grown up hearing that passage applied to Jesus. Jesus is that stumbling block for some people, right? Jesus has become that sanctuary for us too, is our theological claim in this course. So not only is Yahweh God identified as the temple, but the New Testament sees this passage as anticipatory of Jesus, who again is the personal God who is a dwelling place in himself. In Ezekiel 47:1, for instance, the prophet anticipates the renewal of God's temple. Israel, they're not always faithful, and sometimes the temple ministry is led by people who are not being faithful, and the temple rituals and the temple ministry is just perfunctory, and God just, it's full of idolatry at times, and so God is upset, and so people recognize the need to renew the temple, especially after the temple has been torn down in the exile. The need for temple renewal is present in the prophets. Ezekiel 47:1 is a place where the prophet anticipates the renewal of the temple and the recreation of the land with a stream of living water that just flows out from underneath the threshold of the temple. And there is this theme in the prophets where the prophets anticipate the day when the temple would be renewed and all the nations would come to Jerusalem, and the temple would unite the nations and fructify, make the whole world full of good fruit, right? So there's this anticipation in the prophets that the temple is going to be renewed, and one of the signs that the temple will be remade and made new is that the nations that bear God's name will come together in Jerusalem and be part of one people and one temple again, which of course hadn't happened that I know of since Eden. And so Amos 9 verse 11 says, "In that day I will restore David's fallen tent. I will repair its broken places." The prophet is looking forward to a day when the temple's going to be renewed. "I will restore its ruins, and I will build it as it used to be, so that the renewed nation, will come to possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord, who will do these things. Now, I know I'm going really fast here, but I want to mention to you that in Acts 15, James cites this prophecy about the renewal of the temple, uniting all the nations who together bear God's name. James says, this is what this text is about. It's about the church accepting all the Gentiles, all the nations into the church through faith, because the temple is being renewed and all the nations who bear God's name are a part of it by faith in Jesus. Interesting and fascinating text. And we'll start to develop these connections more as we go on. So my point here is that you don't have to graduate from a concept of sacred space. The idea that Jesus came to us as God incarnate means that God can take up special residence in one person, in a body, in one location. In First Corinthians 14, verse 25, people come and say, they see all of the good things and the prophecy that's going on and the upbuilding and the love that's in the midst of the Corinthian congregation, and Paul anticipates that people who don't know God exactly the way the church does will come in and they will say, God is really among you. He's really among you. And so, yes, God is everywhere, and no tent or building can contain God. I understand, but God can take up, according to His will, a very special presence, and can dwell in a very special way among His own special people, among very special places that He deputizes for that purpose. And so these temple movements in the Psalms and the prophets, they all look forward to the renewal of the temple and the glory that once inhabited the temple. And so I just want to kind of go on and talk about some historical temple renewal movements here, not just the Psalms and the prophets, of course, not about just the whole story of the Bible. We talked about the whole story of the Bible, the story of the Psalms and the renewal of in the Psalms of temple theology, not only about the prophets and the way they anticipated that the temple would be renewed, but there was a sect called the Psalms of Solomon sect, which wrote some psalms, some songs about 60s BC, okay? About 60 years before Jesus. And they saw the problem with Israel and creation in terms of a corrupt priesthood and a desecrated temple. In their writings, they accuse the Hasmonean dynasty of priests, and that whole dynasty of people who were ruling over Israel in the Roman occupation. They accuse them of adultery and incest and judicial heavy-handedness and ostentation and exploitation of widows and stealing from the sanctuary, embezzlement of church funds, right? And the community, this Psalm of Solomon sect, believed that this wickedness brought about the temple's desecration by the Roman general Pompey. And secondly, that community, however, believed that itself was an alternative to the temple establishment. They saw themselves as an expression or a transition into the eschatological, the end time renewal of the temple. They believed that they were called by God to renew the temple itself. And they expressed this willingness to renew the temple by their willingness to suffer, to identify with the poor, and to drive out sinners from the temple. Okay. The Psalm of Solomon sect then anticipated the renewal of the temple, and they believed themselves to be the instrument through which God was renewing the temple. Okay. And that's 60 years before Jesus. All right. Now, the Qumran sect, some of you have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This Dead Sea Scrolls come from Qumran. And the Qumran sect, which is from about 100 to 50 BC, again, the same kind of period that we're talking about, points fingers at the established priesthood in the days before Jesus in many of the same kind of ways. Qumran was a counter-temple renewal movement, right? They accused the priesthood of fornication and arrogance and theft and addiction to filthy lucre, money they had no right to. Qumran, however, looks forward to when its party of the Yahad would not only identify with the poor, but be willing to and be willing to suffer, but also to be. Now listen to this. I'm just going to read from one of the Qumran texts. We're going to be truly established, an eternal planting, a temple for Israel, and a mystery, a holy of holies for Aaron. This is what Qumran thinks it is, or what it's becoming, and what God will make it. True witnesses to justice, chosen by God's will to atone for the land, to recompense the wicked their due. They will be said to be the tested wall, the precious cornerstone, whose foundation shall neither be shaken nor swayed, a fortress, all of them knowing the covenant of justice, and therefore thereby offering a sweet savor. And they shall be a blameless and true house in Israel, upholding the covenant of eternal statutes. They shall be an acceptable sacrifice, atoning for the land and ringing in the verdict against evil, so that perversity ceases to exist. What a incredible vision they had. And they believed themselves to be a community that was going to be responsible for renewing God's temple, and that Qumran would become God's new temple. Okay? So in the years before Jesus is coming on the scene as the Jewish Jesus of Nazareth, there are all kinds of communities that are working for and have the expectation, both biblically and in terms of social need, they are looking forward to the renewal of the temple. Okay? Just notice that the community, like the later church, self-consciously sees itself as the temple. Notice that Qumran in this kind of identification thought its vocational purpose was to shape society and creation. The community sees itself as being instrumental in dawning a new age. The community is viewed through the lens of temple imagery. They are a temple garden. They are a divine presence in the Holy of Holies. They're an unshakable protective compound. Okay? They are banishing evil, and they're atoning for the land in ongoing creation. And the temple is renewed in the persons of the community in a way that anticipates the way the church would say Jesus has renewed the temple, and we are in Christ that new temple and that new place where God mysteriously dwells and is renewing creation. If you look in Paul's epistles, the idea that the church in Jesus Christ as a temple is just everywhere. But I will just simply point you to 1 Corinthians 3:16, where it just kind of flatly says that you are God's temple, right? And Ignatius, later on, the earliest of the fathers, says this in his letter to the Ephesians: "You are stones of the temple." He writes the church. He writes the church in Ephesus, and he says, Ignatius does, "You are stones of the temple, drawn up on high by the instrument of Jesus Christ, which is the cross, by which you ascended, and your love led up to God. You are God bearers, temple bearers, Christ bearers," right? So the point is that Jesus claims to be the temple. The church claims that Jesus was that renewer of the temple in himself. And he is what communities actually expected scripturally before him. And they saw the sociological need for the renewal of the temple. And the same convictions followed Jesus in the primitive church and the early fathers. It's not just a theological and a canonical conviction, but it's a historical reality that everybody was looking for the guy who would restore the temple. They weren't just looking for a Messiah; they were looking for a Messiah who would restore the temple. And so this is kind of the background I wanted you to get for what John then claims. I wanted just to touch base quickly before we quit by touching base with these basic scriptures so that you can hear the basic argument that is being made in the chapter that you read for this session. In John 1:14, the text says, "The Word became flesh." This Word, in the beginning, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? Not only is the Word that essential part of God which God can speak forth into the world, right? Um, um, he is also that glory that can emanate into the temple. And Jesus is identified as the very essence of God and the Word of God that proceeds in the creation of the world, that speaks the world into existence. Jesus is that Logos, Christ, but he's also that glory which comes and emanates into the Holy of Holies, and that leads Israel on its journeys. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. Okay, the word dwelled is a skenosin in Greek. And that word means literally, he pitched his tent among us. And that's very, very telling, you see. It's not just that Jesus came to the world as a person. He came to the world and pitched his tent. And the very next kind of words, the very next kind of thing in John's mind is, we have seen his glory. Now, glory doesn't just mean that Jesus was luminous and famous, right? Glory has a very specific biblical meaning and a whole history of usage, right? The history of the usage is Exodus 40, verse 34, where the glory of God comes down out of heaven and the glory of God fills the tabernacle in Israel's midst. And so this is the background for God pitched his tent. The Word pitched his tent and dwelled among us. And we The testimony of the church is we have seen his glory. We've seen the glory of the tabernacle return to Israel in Jesus Christ. This is the Johannine prologue and how John describes Jesus to us and the identity of Jesus to us. In chapter 1 and verse 51, there's that verse where Jesus confronts Nathanael. You'll remember that, I think. Maybe we should just spot read that today as we go through this together. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false." John 1:47, now verse 48. "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were under a fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You shall see greater things than that." He then added, "I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Now, that is almost a word for word translation of the Septuagint, the Greek version of Genesis 28, where, as we've already talked about a little bit, Jacob encounters God and God's promise of giving the land to Israel. And there Jacob sees the ladder of angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And he calls that place the gate of heaven, the house of God, Bethel. And so Jesus is suggesting to Nathanael here, you're going to have Jacob's temple experience. Not only are you going to believe because I can see you and I have an understanding of who you are as a person based on what happened when you were called. I am the one who will make it possible in this kingdom for you to see heaven opened, to see and enter through the gates of heaven, to see and know that this is where you can dwell in the house, in God's house. Okay. After the wedding ceremony, where Jesus goes to Cana in Galilee and turns the water into wine, in chapter 2 and verse 11 of John, it says, "Thus Jesus revealed his glory." Now, glory has been used one other time in John's gospel, and we know where that is. It's in 1:14, and it's where Jesus is said to have pitched his tent, right? And we have seen his glory. It's in the verses following all of that. And so, contextually speaking, when Jesus reveals his glory, he's revealing his temple glory. He's revealing himself to be the place where the divine and human meet, where heaven and earth meet, where the glory of God dwells among us. Okay. Then in chapter 2 and verse 13, there's a series of verses that I think we ought to really get under our belt as we think about Jesus, the temple. And they're John chapter 2, and I'm going to start reading in verse 13 and continue through verse 22. Okay. John 13 through 22. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem in the temple courts, and he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. And so he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle, and he scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned the temple. those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" And so Jesus is renewing the temple here. He's cleansing the temple. He's getting rid of, he's doing everything that all of the temple renewal movements anticipated that a Messiah might do. He's driving the wickedness out of the temple, right? This is not a place where people ought to be skimming money and making money. This is a place where we ought to pour our hearts out in generosity to God. And his disciples remembered, verse 17, that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me," right? This is a text, as we have seen, that applies to David, and the Davidic king would be zealous for God's house. In fact, that zeal would end up consuming the suffering servant of God, yes. But this zeal for the house also involves this wanting to renew God's house. And this is what both David and Jesus are working for. And in verse 18, when the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove you have authority to drive out all these money changers," for instance, right? And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I'll raise it again in 3 days." And the Jews replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. This is the first of a number of John's asides. John will break into the narrative and tell us what's going on several times in the Gospel of John, and this is the first instance of it. And it's the result of people being dull-minded. They've got a defunct temple theology that has been flattened and demystified so that they cannot understand what Jesus is saying, right? That they don't get that Jesus is talking about his own body, the destruction of the temple, this new place where God now has chosen to dwell. If you destroy this temple of my body, I'll raise it again in 3 days. The temple he was talking about was his body, both his physical body and ultimately the church, his body. Yes. And so every time people just don't get stuff, right? When Nicodemus comes at night and he doesn't know what it's like to be born again, when the woman comes to him and talks to him at the well and doesn't understand about the water that will well up for eternal life. All of these things where Jesus's conversation partners in the Gospel of John talk, and they don't understand. It's because they don't understand how the temple theology and the temple symbolism is working in the Gospel of John. We'll unpack that as we go along, but I just want to get it out there. Little side note here. Don't get too frustrated with how fast we're going. We're covering a lot of material. I know, a lot of material, but we're just introducing concepts now that we're going to unpack as we go along. I have to do it in this broad way first. You'll understand why we do it. But right now, I'm just trying to unpack how John is talking about Jesus as the renewed temple in Israel. One of the passages that I think is really telling, and it's not in the Johannine prologue, but it's in chapter 12. Let's read about verse 37. Jesus was doing some miraculous signs in John 12:37. And after he'd done all those miraculous signs in their presence, they still wouldn't believe in him. And then John enters in again. This was, and he tells us, this was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet. Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For this reason, they couldn't believe, because as Isaiah says elsewhere, he has blinded their eyes and deadened their hearts, so that they can't see with their eyes, nor understand with their hearts, nor turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah uh, uh, said this, verse 41, it says, because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. That's an incredible claim. Did you catch it? John says that Isaiah said this. Be ever hearing, right? But not understanding, that kind of stuff. Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. Now, most of us, when we just read through the Bible in a cursory way, might ask ourselves, when in the world did the prophet Isaiah meet Jesus? Well, the verse that is cited here is a verse from Isaiah 6. And Isaiah starts saying these things because Isaiah has indeed had a vision of the temple. And if you go with me to Isaiah 6 tonight, we'll kind of use this as a stunning passage, I think, that really gets at the identity of who Jesus is. It's when Isaiah is commissioned as a prophet. In Isaiah 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Isaiah 6:1. Now, verse 2. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying, and they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the sound of their voices, and at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, said Isaiah. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. And then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with at the tongs of the altar. With it, he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. This I want to suggest to you is what John is talking about in John 12:41. Isaiah saw the King, the Lord Almighty. He saw Jesus, the glory of God, in the midst of God's holy temple, in the Holy of Holies. And the whole train filled the whole thing, and the whole thing shook. God's glory in Jesus Christ was exactly what Isaiah experienced. And that's the reason Jesus talked, citing Isaiah 6. Interesting, fascinating stuff for me. So tonight, I'm trying to explain how all of those texts point to Jesus as that presence which fills the temple, Jesus as that glory which fills the tabernacle, Jesus that temple embodiment of God's, where heaven and earth meet, where humanity and God come together in the person and the priesthood of Jesus. And so I'm moving from text to text to text, I know, but each of them in their own way is pointing to Jesus as the renewed temple in Israel in the Gospel of John. And that's just the starting place for us. You're going to ask me, what's the pay dirt about this? Well, I mean, one of the things is we just need to know who Jesus is. But there's going to be a lot of pay dirt come down, a lot of consequences to all of this as we move along. And so not only is the text of the Gospel of John saying these things, but it is part of a whole historical movement where lots of people both anticipated socially the need for temple renewal, and they read their Old Testament, they read the Psalms, they read the prophets, they understood that God's creative purpose was to have a functioning temple to recreate, through which he could recreate the world. And so when Jesus comes to us, he comes to us as the renewal of that temple with the vital glory and power of God, and that is now made incarnate in Jesus. And so I'm really excited about how this course will continue on from that foundation. Have a great week. I hope that the 3 sections of questions that you do with this will be of great benefit to you. Really press in and think hard about your own experience of awe, and what stories and what images and what things were present. Where were you when these things first took place? And delve into your own heart, your own inner temple, and see where awe comes from in the depth of your own life. And then use the kind of concepts that we're beginning to develop here in chapter 1 to think about ministry and the kinds of ministry that might help the world experience awe and wonder at the glory of God in our human midst. Grace and peace to everybody. Have a great week.